Good morning, or afternoon, I should say. It's been a long morning and a long afternoon, I guess, for those who have traveled great distances. So it is officially the afternoon, and I have the challenge, I guess, of giving the afternoon lecture when everyone has eaten and the temperature is a little bit on the increase. So hopefully I can keep everyone awake. We do have quite an engaging topic here in the Epistle of Jude. First of all, I'd just like to thank the Richard Ecclesia for putting this gathering on. It certainly is a wonderful event. This is our first time here with my wife, Sister Vicki, and our two children, and it's certainly something we've been looking forward to for almost a year now when we made plans to make it up here. So we greatly appreciate the effort and bring you fraternal greetings from the Bereans of the Southeastern Ecclesia. Certainly this topic of Jude fits well in the overall theme for the gathering, having to do with the apathy and apostasy of the last days, which we know, of course, has all been prophesied in Scripture. And the purpose of considering the lessons here from Jude will be as exhortational as possible. It's a negative subject in the sense that we're dealing with how do we deal with problems, contentions amongst ourselves within the ecclesia, really, because it's dealing more so with that than with the world, and we'll discuss that. But it also, Lord willing, will provide an exhortation to us all as well concerning earnestly contending, which we know, of course, really begins with us each individually in contending against the wiles of the diabolos within our own human nature. That's where we must first contend if we ever seek to be successful in helping others. If there was ever a need to contend or to stand fast for the principles of the truth, it was in the days of Jude. In that Jude wrote just prior to AD 70, I think that we will be able to see some very stark parallels to our day. And this epistle of Jude provides an exhortation, as we mentioned, and a call for earnest contention for the faith at a very similar time to which you and I live, namely a time when we are on the brink of judgment. Our classes this weekend will represent only a thumbnail sketch of the letter of Jude. There was a handout, I think, that's been distributed. That's just something to take away, to place in your Bibles as some notes. We're not going to follow that necessarily every single thing that's in there. But we will provide an overview of this letter. Since we do have three classes, we will consider the letter mostly verse by verse, but there'll be because of time constraints, that won't always be possible. There's much here, and we would certainly encourage individual diligent study of this letter as a source of strength and comfort in these last days. We appreciate the opportunity to present this material this weekend in context, as we mentioned, of the general theme, contending against apostasy and apathy in these last days. We would suggest that this letter of Jude is without a doubt pertinent to that particular topic, and the others that are being dealt with as well certainly are also. The exhortations from Esther contain much of that same message, contending for the faith, and certainly the topic of the Judges, which is being considered, where every man was doing that which is right in his own eyes in the days of the Judges. So this, we might say, is the New Testament, one of the New Testament areas we can turn to when considering this issue of contending for the faith. So let's begin by simply asking the question, who was Jude? Well, in addition to, we know, Judas Iscariot, there was another Jude that was numbered amongst the 12 disciples. But we do not believe that he was the author of the epistle. And of course we know the author was not Judas Iscariot. We believe that the author was Jude, or Judas, or more correctly, Judah, which is a name that signifies praise, the brother of James, who, of course, would make him, therefore, the half-brother of the Lord Jesus Christ. So he is Jude, the Lord's half-brother. One Judas was certainly numbered amongst the Lord's half-brothers. The Lord's own family, we know, at first supported him, but then, as he became more widely acclaimed, they turned against him and tried even to restrain him at times. Possibly the Lord's immediate family feared that his preaching would eventually lead to an uprising by the Jews, leading to a large-scale disaster for all of them. Thus, John 7, verses 3 through 5 record that they did not believe initially. And of course we know prophetically from Psalm 69, the psalmist wrote prophetically of Christ, I am become a stranger unto my brethren and an alien unto my mother's children. My mother's children. And this, of course, would be the natural children of Mary and Joseph in that instance. It may even be implied from Matthew chapter 12, verses 46 through 50, that the Lord's own mother, Mary, at one point in time, early on, although remaining basically loyal to the Lord, tried to persuade him to pursue another course. This is when he commented that he had no mother or brother except those that followed the commandments of his father. That's in Matthew chapter 12. But of course it was the Lord's own resurrection which would provide the convincing proof which became the turning point for his half-brothers and his family members. The Lord appeared to James, we're told in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, possibly because James himself would prove to be a major influence within the rest of the family and persuade them to fully embrace the truth. After the Lord's resurrection, we know that his own immediate family kept company with the other apostles, some of them rising even to prominence among the brethren. And that's recorded in the first of Acts, where we have Mary and the other members of the Lord's immediate family now part of the ecclesia. They became members of the ecclesia once they worked out some of the difficulties in their own minds. James, we know, brother of James is how Jude is described here. James became, we know, a leading member of the Jerusalem ecclesia, and that's recorded in Acts 12, verse 17, and Acts 15, verse 13, and there's also mentioned again in Galatians 1, verse 9. Thus, an epistle written by his brother in the flesh, namely Jude, who we're going to consider this weekend, would have carried considerable weight amongst the other epistles at this particular time in apostolic history, because he was part of the Lord's immediate family. Why did Jude write? What was his purpose in writing? Well, we know that he wrote concerning the common salvation. That is, the principles which may lead us to salvation. The letter is a call to contention. The purity of the one faith at this particular point in apostolic history was being openly and consistently undermined by false brethren within the ecclesias. There was an urgent need, therefore, for ecclesias to be shaken out of their lethargic state. For we know, sadly, it is when an ecclesia is in that lethargic, apathetic state that false brethren are enabled to pursue their course unchallenged. There sadly comes a time, we know, that contention within an ecclesia becomes really a matter of necessity if the truth is to survive. If the truth is to survive. And this, of course, is James 3, verse 17, that the truth must be first pure, then peaceable. So there does come a point in time when contention within ecclesias becomes a matter of necessity if the truth is to survive, if we have an interest in the truth actually surviving. Jude's epistle is not simply a letter of warning and rebuke. As we mentioned, there is much exhortation in the letter of Jude, even though much of it is negative. There is much exhortation in this letter. 3 times Jude refers to his readers as beloved. Beloved. And this is the Greek word agapetos, which we get from where we get the Greek word agape, agapetos. And it's the same word used by the Father to describe the love that he had for his own Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, in Matthew 3:17, where he said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased," at the time of his baptism. So we might pose the question, could anyone exhibit a greater love than this? And Jude is using the same term here, beloved, when he addresses his readers. Jude's loyalty to the truth, coupled with the intense love that he felt for his brethren, provided the basis for his strong opposition towards those who were undermining the truth and destroying the faith within ecclesias at this particular time of apostolic history. Jude is a short epistle, but written with a compelling urgency against a background of enormous danger for the ecclesias. The very survival of the truth, brothers and sisters, was much at stake at this time in apostolic history. The epistle of Jude is very much an endorsement of apostolic teachings, particularly the second epistle of Peter. It is very evident that Jude had been a diligent student of Peter's final letter, for he refers to it several times throughout his own letter. The similarity between Jude and 2 Peter is quite striking and unmistakable. The letter is therefore an endorsement, as we said, of apostolic teaching. Jude is writing after the earlier apostles, and so it's an endorsement of their teachings that have gone before. And it shows the corruption that was appearing within the ecclesias. It was confirming those earlier prophecies and that they had become a reality. As mentioned, 2 Peter chapter 2 is referred to and actually quoted in verses 17 and 8 of Jude's letter. The false and the true were now, in Jude's time, beginning to be clearly seen, and the false were openly manifesting themselves, an indication of their growing strength and influence. We note, for example, these statements by Jude. Verse 4, "There are certain men crept in unawares." All this had been warned about by the Apostle Paul and Peter, that this would come about within the ecclesias. We know that there was a honeymoon phase, we might say, in the early chapters of Acts, where the ecclesia was all one and they all had things in common and so forth. But then these things over time deteriorated, just like, frankly, they have within the Christadelphian body. We're no longer in the pioneering days of Brother Thomas and Roberts and others. Those days are long gone, and things have much deteriorated well over 100 years later. So these are this is Jude's confirmation that those warnings written by the earlier apostles had now come about in his day. Verse 10, "These speak evil." Verse 11, "They have gone in the way of Cain and ran greedily after the error of Balaam." Verse 12, "These are spots in your feasts." Verse 16, "These are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lusts, their mouths speaking great swelling words. These be they who separate themselves." These are all the descriptions that Jude gives to those who are causing such turmoil in his day. And that which was at stake, brothers and sisters, was the very survival of the truth itself, as we mentioned. And that demonstrates to us that this epistle has its setting, if you will, within the intimate environment of the ecclesia. Verse 12, for example, mentions your feasts of love, which was the gathering of the ecclesias, which sadly by this time, for the memorial remembrance, which had been perverted by this time in many ecclesias. And so the setting, if you will, of this epistle is not really conflict between the world in the ecclesia. While that certainly existed then, and it exists now in our day, the setting of this epistle is not conflict between the world and the ecclesia, but contention within the ecclesias themselves, because the purity of the truth was in fact under attack. There was a conflict within the ecclesias between the forces of light and darkness. Now, who were the false teachers specifically? Some have suggested in some commentaries that you look at that the false brethren were Gnostics. That is sometimes alleged. But when we rely on the writings of Peter and Jude, it becomes fairly clear that the brethren who were causing problems at this particular point in time were not the Gnostics, but rather they were brethren who considered themselves, if you will, to be saved Christadelphians. Saved Christadelphians. And therefore above all law. They were a factional party that took up an extreme position in opposition to the Judaizers. We're of course familiar with what the Judaizers were all about. In the early first century pages, they were a group that wanted to maintain certain aspects of the law and force that position. The debate over circumcision and so forth, for example. Well, by Jude's time, we had an opposite extreme taken up in opposition to the Judaizers. But this teaching, being the other extreme, was equally as destructive as the Judaizing elements. And the apostles had warned that their teachings would be perverted. And just a few of those here. The Apostle Paul mentions one of them in Romans 6 verses 1 and 2 that is the opposite extreme position of the Judaizing position. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? And then also Acts 20 verses 30 and 31. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them. Therefore watch and remember that by the space of 3 years I cease not to warn everyone day and night, or everyone night and day with tears. That's Acts 20, 30 through 31. And also 2 Peter 3, 16 and 17, again, the epistle which Jude heavily relies on. As also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things, in which are some things hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures, unto their own destruction. Ye therefore, beloved, seeing ye know these things before, beware lest ye also be led away with the error of the wicked, and fall from your own steadfastness. And you'll note at the bottom of that slide there's several other references that we would direct you to that we think identifies clearly those who are now troubling the ecclesias in a big way that Jude was having to contend with. 2 Peter 2, 3, 18 and 20, he mentions those again. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1, and 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1. All are indications of the problem now that was being manifested in Jude's time. The position that some of these false teachers were taking, put simply, was that because all men are sinners, we should continue in sin that grace might abound. These false teachers were in effect proclaiming, and this is grossly oversimplified, but in effect they were proclaiming that baptism and attendance at meetings would ensure salvation. Baptism and attendance at meetings would assure salvation. And that God could only exercise grace or mercy upon sinners. And that therefore sin could be justified upon those grounds, or it could be allowed. Let us continue in sin that grace might abound. Thus, there was now an urgent need, brothers and sisters, in the time of Jude to contend earnestly for the faith. We should remember that these destructive philosophies were not now so much a matter of prophecy, but were being openly manifested and proclaimed within the ecclesias, often by influential brethren who had gained prominence and standing among brethren. Sadly, they had craftily perverted Paul's doctrine found in Ephesians 2, verse 8. By grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. They perverted the part, by grace you are saved, and left out the rest, that it's got to be through faith. That such false brethren would rise to prominence had been the subject of numerous apostolic prophecies, as we read a few moments ago. Now we want to mention just for a moment that there are three key words that dominate this epistle that we will see over and over again as we consider it. We've already mentioned one of those, and that is the term beloved, agapetos. And that occurs 3 times in verse 1, verse 17, and verse 20 of the epistle. The term ungodly occurs some 6 times, interestingly, because that, of course, we know is the number of flesh. Verse 4, verse 15, and verse 18. And then finally, one of the other oft-occurring words is the term preserved. Preserved. It occurs 5 times throughout the epistle, rendered in different ways. In verse 1, it's rendered reserved. In verse 6 and 13, it's rendered kept. And also it's rendered keep, verse 21. So it's interesting that we have the beloved on the one side of the ledger, if you will, and the ungodly on the other side of the ledger. Both parties are reserved for something in the divine purpose. The beloved will be preserved to inherit the kingdom of God, and the ungodly will be reserved for divine judgment. That is really a theme that comes through this epistle. And this chart, which is not ornamented, I took it from one of the sources that we looked at, is an interesting chart, speaking of both sides of that ledger. Jude reveals these dramatic points of difference between false and true brethren. And just scan down that list there and note the verses. The false would be engaged in immorality in verse 4. That's contrasted with true brethren who were contending for the faith in verse 3. The false brethren would be consumed with evil thinking in verse 8 versus the true brethren who would remember the purity of the faith. They would take up Malachi's exhortation to speak often of the truth one with another, remembering to do that in purity and truth. The false would speak evil in verses 8 and 10 versus the true brethren who would build up oneself in the faith. The false would be engaged in hypocrisy versus the true offering faithful prayer in sincerity and truth and not in hypocrisy. Verse 20. The false would be engaged in a religion without real humility towards God, whereas the true brethren would seek strength and forgiveness from the Father. The false brethren in Jude's day would be in opposition toward those striving to keep the faith. We note that in the 16th verse. Whereas true brethren would show compassion to help those who truly needed help and desired help, pulling them out of the fire. Verse 22. The false would be consumed with pride and arrogance in verse 16, whereas the true brethren would reject the evil of the flesh in verse 23. The false brethren finally would be motivated by flesh only and not by the Spirit, whereas true brethren in verse 24 would look to the future, waiting in hope on the return of their Lord. So I thought that was interesting as a contrast in those themes that we have throughout the letter, which certainly serve as an exhortation to ourselves. So how do we approach a study of this letter this weekend? Well, this is just a general outline of the epistle that we're going to attempt to follow in the classes. The first 2 verses, and really to include also the 3rd verse, I would suggest, provide very much an introduction to the letter, and we will consider those 3 verses for the remainder of our time this afternoon here in a moment. But then in our second class tomorrow, we will look at the need to contend and the specific apostasy that these false teachers were setting forth in verses 3 through 16. And again, this is just one suggestion that's been made for breaking this letter down to try to get a handle on it in our minds. So in verses 3 through 4, we have the three basic denials. We'll talk about that tomorrow. What were the fundamental doctrines that were really being denied by these false brethren in Jude's day? We set forth a real overview of it from Romans 6. Let us continue in sin that grace may abound. But we're going to get into more detail on what Jude has to say about where these false brethren were really coming from and the fundamental truths that were being denied. There are then three historic examples set forth in verses 5 to 7 concerning the certain doom that would come upon these brethren ultimately. There's three historic examples set forth in verses 8 through 11 that speak of their impious ways. Their utter depravity is set forth in verses 12 through 13, where Jude uses 6 terrible metaphors that we'll talk about that are very interesting. And then finally the testimony of Enoch in verses 14 through 16, which speak to the final destruction of the seed of the serpent, which is where we could classify all that is false, really. And then so our third class, which would be Sunday, we'll look at ways in which we should contend. Available resources for contending for the truth that Jude sets forth in verses 17 through the end of the chapter. Namely, verses 17 and 18, recognizing that apostasy has been foretold. We can't deny that it has been predicted. You know, the situation that ecclesias find themselves in is something that's been predicted. It's been prophesied of old, just like it had been for Jude. Verse 19, we'll look at analyzing actions and fruits. Verses 20 to 21, drawing upon divine resources that we have at our disposal to combat apostasy. Verses 22 to 23, we'll talk about the principle that we must seek to reclaim where possible. That's the compassion that we must show for others who may have stumbled out of the way, if you will. And then verses 24 to 25, the final thoughts of Jude resting upon the help, mercy, and the grace of Yahweh. The natural division in this epistle occurs at verse 17 with the statement, but beloved. Having warned his writers in verses 1 through 17 essentially of the dangerous influence of apostasy, Jude, beginning of verse 17, then instructs his beloved readers how to counter it. And so that's the general outline we're going to attempt to follow as best we can. And again, I think we'll have time to go almost verse by verse, but when we get really tomorrow, there's a lot there, verses 3 through 16. So we may be doing that very quickly to make sure we can get it all in. So let's begin with the first 3 verses in consideration for the remaining time that we have. Verses 1 through 3. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James, to them that are sanctified by God the Father and preserved in Jesus Christ and called, mercy unto you and peace and love be multiplied. Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and to exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. We mentioned the name Jude. We've identified, of course, that he's the brother of James, half-brother of the Lord. Jude is a short version of Judah, which means praise. He was not one of the 12 disciples, hence his own omission of that title. He describes himself here as servant of Jesus Christ. Jude, the servant of Jesus Christ. This word for servant is the Greek doulos, which means bond slave. Bond slave. The same word is used by James at the beginning of his epistle, and it's used by the Apostle Paul at the beginning of Romans, the beginning of Titus, and it's used by Peter in his second epistle, chapter 1, verse 1. And it's really a term of humility, is it not? That he is the bond slave of the Lord Jesus Christ. In humility here, Jude does not boast of any fleshly relationship that he might have to the Lord Jesus Christ. He does not claim any form of equality, but willingly debased himself as a bondslave. And you and I, brothers and sisters, all believers, are constituted bondslaves of the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 22. But he that is called in the Lord, being a servant, is the Lord's freeman. Likewise also he that is called, being free, is Christ's servant. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. And also Ephesians 6, Ephesians 6, verse 6. Servants, be obedient unto them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of your heart, as unto Christ, not with eye service as men pleasers, but as the servants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, with good will doing service as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that whatsoever good thing any man doeth, the same shall he receive of the Lord, whether he be bond or free. We note here that he writes to them that are sanctified by God the Father. They are sanctified by God the Father. This Greek word, of course, we know means to make holy, to make clean, or to sanctify. This is achieved through the operation of the Word of God. The same word here for sanctified occurs in Ephesians 5, verse 26, which you have there, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of the water by the Word. To attain to this state, it is essential for the believer to separate from the world and to dedicate his life to God. That therefore requires the operation of the cleansing and transforming power of the Word. Hence, believers are termed saints, which is derived from the same word. We have here also the same word as rendered in Matthew 6, verse 9, hallowed be thy name, in the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed, set apart, holy. The implication being therefore quite clear of what Yahweh now is, we are called upon to become. 1 Peter 1, 14 to 16, as obedient children, not fashioning ourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye also holy in all manner of conversation, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. We are to become separated, dedicated, and made clean or holy. And so Jude's very opening words thus constitute a challenge to all believers. A challenge to all believers, reminding them that at the very outset of their responsibilities to God and their very purpose of being called to the truth is the call to holiness. And they are sanctified, it says here in verse 1, by God the Father, and preserved in Jesus Christ and called. This word preserve is the Greek tereo, which means to watch over, to guard, or to preserve, and is a military term, in fact. This word is not common in the apostles, the verb of this word occurs in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, where our inheritance is reserved in heaven or preserved in heaven. This also occurs in some of Paul's final letters in 1 Timothy 5:22, chapter 6, verse 14, and 2 Timothy 4, verse 7. But it most commonly applies and appears this word preserved in these latter epistles of Scriptures, mostly in 1 John, 2 Peter, and here in Jude. The idea thus predominates of being preserved through divine power until Christ's second coming, a preservation which became a more urgent need with the increasing falling away from the truth in Jude's day. What a dramatic setting for the usage of this very word. And of course the word called, they are preserved in Jesus Christ and called. This Greek word kalitos, derived from klesis, which forms part of the word ecclesia, we know, it conveys the idea of a call or invitation or an appointment to an office, and also the welcome that one receives on such occasions. It is therefore a word which defines the wonderful binding together in love of the family of God. We note the occurrence of this Greek word kletos in Romans 1 verse 7, where the phrase is literally translated saints by calling. Saints by calling, or saints by their calling. Jude has now begun to lay the foundation for the words that would follow, which constitute the main core of his message in his day to the ecclesias. This is a direct and dynamic opening in this first verse. And when considering the words which are to follow, it becomes all the more clear of our high calling as bond slaves, sanctified brothers and sisters who have been made holy and preserved and called in Christ Jesus. And so, the call to the truth, brothers and sisters, as indicated here in Jude and throughout Scripture, is a call to the truth which involves an invitation, separation, and dedication. Doing the will of the Father and His Son would bring believers into conflict with the world at large. We know that, of course, from the time we come into the truth. We are instantly at conflict with our neighbors, our employer, with those on the outside. But in Jude's day, many prominent brethren, sadly, did not wish to see the differences emphasized between the world and the ecclesias. They wanted to continue in sin, that grace would abound. But Jude argued for sanctification, for being preserved and being called. We are summoned or invited into the truth. We are welcomed lovingly into the family of God, made holy, clean, and sanctified, separated from the ungodliness of the world, and dedicated to serving Israel's God. We are watched over when we do these things, guarded and preserved by the Lord Jesus Christ. Thus, in these opening words of his epistle, Jude set forth the dramatic contrast between what the Word of God required from believers and the attitudes and philosophies which were being widely proclaimed by false teachers. We just mentioned a few things in this second verse. Mercy unto you and peace and love be multiplied. We have mercy here mentioned, peace and love. If we receive mercy, it indicates that we are in need of it. If we receive mercy, it indicates that we are in need of it. And it also indicates that the one extending the mercy has the power to implement its principles. Mercy, we believe, is a divine characteristic. Therefore, we must implement it as best we can towards others. The next progression in the verse talks of peace. And note this progression. Mercy comes before peace. We cannot attain to peace without receiving divine mercy. Mercy is an act of God, and peace is that which results. Whenever these two words occur together, they always follow in this order, with the exception of Galatians 6, verse 16. Mercy and then peace. Similarly, in the apostolic salutations throughout the New Testament, whenever grace and mercy occur, they are always in that order. Peace, we would suggest, is equivalent to fellowship, to true fellowship between ourselves and the Father. When there is peace, there is unity and oneness and mutual well-being. The Greek word here means peace, rest in contrast with strife, and denoting the absence or end of strife. That's from Mr. Bullinger's Companion Bible. He defines peace as rest in contrast with strife and denoting the absence or end of strife. In its apostolic usage, therefore, it points forward to the end of this age, ultimately, when the spiritual warfare within our own flesh will be ended, and when victory over the flesh will culminate in perfect spiritual and physical union or fellowship with the Father and His Son. You remember we mentioned that when we get to this idea of contending, we must first contend with ourselves, brothers and sisters, against the diabolos in our own nature. We've received the mercy of God in order to be able to do that, and ultimate peace will come with a change of nature. That's where contending really begins, with our own problems, our own nature. The third word mentioned in this verse is love. And here the word love is the Greek agape. We heard once a very good definition of agape as follows: a profound respect or reverence based upon knowledge and manifested by self-denial. We know there's different words for love in the New Testament. There's the word phileo, which means a fondness, a friendship. That's not the word we're dealing with here. We're dealing with the word agape, which is a self-sacrificing, self-denying love. It is a profound respect or reverence based upon knowledge and manifested by self-denial. That is agape love. That is the love that Christ had for His brethren. Jude has thus set forth three blessings from Yahweh: mercy, peace, and love, without which we would be lost. Jude's prayer is that these blessings might flow forth to his brethren. But he now proceeds to show that such blessings are dependent upon the faithfulness of Christ's brethren to the truth of God. And of course, that is what the rest of the letter deals with, is that the problems that would have to be resolved. Quickly, we will consider verse 3 at this time, just so we fit that in. It could really go into the second talk or the end of this one. But verse 3, we know, is probably the most well-known or quoted verse of the book. Beloved, when I gave all diligence to write unto you of the common salvation, it was needful for me to write unto you and exhort you that ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. He again uses this term, beloved, which we've talked about. And here it's almost as though he has an urgency here. There's a great urgency in his writing. When I gave all diligence to write unto you. Rotherham renders that, though I was using all diligence to be writing unto you concerning our common salvation, yet I have had necessity to write at once unto you. So it's almost as if he was preparing to write a letter about the common salvation, the common principles of the truth. Something happened, and he felt this urgency to write at once to these brethren about these problems. It had been Jude's intention, we would suggest, to write a letter, but suddenly the matter became one of the utmost urgency. The circumstances surrounding the need for this letter are once again set forth very dramatically. His original intentions appear to have changed. He had planned a letter of exposition and encouragement about the common salvation, but ended up with a letter of warning and rebuke that had become a matter of urgency. The Spirit, we know, would have guided him to see this necessity and move him into the composition of this epistle. And so he writes with great diligence here, a word which means earnestness, zeal, and sometimes the haste with which a thing is done. We mentioned those two there. So diligence, earnestness, zeal, and sometimes the haste with which a thing is done. This is the mental disposition, we might say, that he has when he takes up his pen. Just a couple of notes here on the common salvation from the Greek koinos, which is from where we get the word for fellowship, koinonia. It means belonging to several. Belonging to several. This phrase represents a further reminder to Jude's readers that the brotherhood of Christ held the one faith and the hope of salvation in common as a community. The community of believers must therefore be of one mind on all vital elements of the one faith and in understanding and honoring the principles of divine truth. Any breaking down of the essential principles of the truth, either in belief or practice, would result in a divided ecclesia. It would result in false fellowship. And so it's interesting that an associated word to the word koinonia is used there for the word common. He was going to, of course, exhort them and exhort you, from the Greek parakleo, to call, which means to call to one side. From para, which means to the side, and kleo, to call. So this idea of exhorting them was to call them to his side. To call them to his side. This is an extremely forthright and challenging command. History recorded another classic example of such a call being uttered, also in the face of rising apostasy. And that's found in Exodus 32, verse 26. Let's see here. Did I go too far? Yeah, it is. Thank you. It's kind of hard to see from this angle. Exodus 32, verse 26. Then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, "Who is on Yahweh's side? Let him come unto me." And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And that's the same idea. He was exhorting them or calling them to his side, just as Moses had done. There would be no compromise whatsoever with Jude, the faithful servant of Jesus Christ. He stood firmly on the side of the Lord Jesus and with the apostles. And he called upon his brethren to stand fast with him without compromise. Jude is pointing out that the truth is too precious to be compromised. That ye should earnestly contend. Let's talk about that. That ye should earnestly contend for the faith which was delivered unto the saints. This is an interesting Greek term. If I could pronounce it, I'm not even going to try, but it means to contend about a thing as a combatant. That's from Vine's Expository Dictionary. It means to agonize. The word agonize is part of the Greek word, thus indicating that there is a need on the part of the faithful to contend for the faith to the point of personal sacrifice and suffering. Described by some authors as the strongest word in the New Testament, the word literally means super agony. Super agony. The Greek prefix epi indicating the force and extent of the agony. In apostolic times, the word had particular significance in relation to the Grecian sports, being especially descriptive of the wholehearted, dedicated struggle engaged upon by the athletes to gain the mastery and the victory. So this Greek word is very interesting, and its root means super agony. This is the degree to which we are to contend for the truth. It should be an agonizing experience. And again, we would emphasize that starts with self-denial, denying the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life within ourselves. And you can see the verses that are set forth there. We won't take the time to read those. It's hard for me to do so at this angle, but Philippians 1, verse 27, 1 Timothy 1, verse 18, verse 6 and 12, 2 Timothy 4, 7 through 8. Jude, in this dramatic call for loyalty to the truth, thus pleaded for an undaunted, uncompromising, wholehearted struggle that the truth might survive those attacks being made upon it from within the ecclesias, so that it would continue to shine forth in purity and in power. And so I think we'll pause there for this afternoon. We're a bit over time, and we'll take up tomorrow some additional verses, the middle part of the letter, as we set forth in that outline, in considering the words of this great epistle, whereby we are exhorted to earnestly contend for the precious faith that each of us have. Thank you.